The challenge of celebrating Purim this year is, I think, one that is on manifold planes palpable to us all. This isn't a normal Purim, in as much as this isn't a normal time in which we're living. And it is as a result that the title that I gave to this evening's session in preparation for Purim is celebrating Purim at a time of travail, seeking the silver lining of the semi-tragic story of Megillat Esther. Which I realize is a perspective that may be out of character when we normally think of Megillat Esther. I think I can do a better job of demonstrating the tragic dimension of Megillat Esther than demonstrating that there still is an upbeat note to be discerned and distilled from that tragic note. But I'd like to try to do my best on both of those planes, because I think the tragic note is manifestly present, and yet simultaneously, although a lot of this evening's session will be admittedly grim, I do hope that we'll be able to resolve it into a positive, upbeat note by the time we end. So I hope you won't leave in the middle, because if you leave in the middle, it might be really depressing. But I do hope that by the time we conclude, there'll be a positive resolution of sorts. If I may begin with a reminiscence of 32 years ago, when I'm sure many of you recall the so-called First Gulf War ended on Purim. And I still distinctly remember that year, Shushan Purim was Erev Shabbat. And I remember going from the end of our Sudat Purim to the Beit Knesset for Kabbalat Shabbat, and asked to say some impromptu Divrei Torah at the interface between Purim and Shabbat. I must admit, I don't remember exactly what I said, but I do recall making the observation that it was most apropos that the war ended on Purim, because the end of the Gulf War was manifestly not a story of redemption, something that would be driven home all the more forcefully in the years that followed. And Purim wasn't the story of redemption either. And I recall in this vein an observation attributed to Rav Soloveitchik, Zichrono Livracha, that in the essential tefillah that we say on Purim, likewise on Chanukah, Al Hanisim, there is the extraordinary and almost bizarre interpolation of a word that isn't even Hebrew. Al Hanisim ve'ala Purkan. Why use an Aramaic word in a prayer that is otherwise entirely in Hebrew, and particularly in the Amidah, which is entirely in Hebrew? And of course, considering that Purkan doesn't have any connotation of redemption, it means basically relief and nothing more. And Rav Soloveitchik's response that the Hebrew root of Geula we employ only in two contexts. There is Baruch Atah Hashem Ga'al Yisrael, which is cast in the past tense, referring to God as Redeemer of Yisrael from Egypt, and Baruch Atah Hashem Goel Yisrael, referring to God as Redeemer of Israel in the present tense, or one could argue in the nominative sense, referring to the future redemption. And Purim is neither. It's not Geula. The most you could say about it is Purkan, not more than Purkan. Indeed, in the Sidur of Rav Amram Gaon, I first heard this many years, decades ago from Mori Rabbi Rav Tzal Shlita. In Surah, in the time of the Geonim, Tachnun was recited on Purim. Tachnun, which, of course, in current practice is perhaps the most ubiquitous expression of any kind of even minimal festivity associated with any day of the year. And on Purim they said Tachnun, because it wasn't regarded as a day that measured up to the omission of Tachnun. And perhaps we could also note on the level of practice, perhaps most glaringly, drinking wine to the point of Ad lo Yada seems much closer to escapism from a grim reality than normative holiday rejoicing. Indeed, it is in this vein that Maharal critically distinguishes between the role of drinking on Yom Tov, the Mishteh V'Simcha of Yom Tov, which is indeed to bring a person to a state of spiritual upliftedness, and the Mishteh V'Simcha of the Sudat Purim, which, if anything, is intended more as a debasement than as spiritual upliftedness. Granted, there are different views on this subject, but I'm noting Maharal's in this regard. One might also cite the custom of wearing masks, which admittedly is of relatively recent vintage, only within the last 500 years ago or so, but nonetheless, the mask is perhaps most readily the means for covering up a facial expression of concern and distress. You put on a smile, but it's not really your smile. It is merely a mask of something that implies quite the contrary. And perhaps on the most basic plane, in the simple meaning of the principle of Mishnichnas Adar Marbim B'Simcha, that from when Adar begins, one increases one's happiness, that's not describing a natural state of affairs. In that, whence do we learn this principle? We learn this principle in Masechet Ta'anit, page 29a. The Gemara tells us, Amar Rav Yehuda Berei de Rav Shmuel bar Shilat Mishmei de Rav, Keshem Shem Mishnichnas Av Mematim B'Simcha, Kach Mishnichnas Adar Marbim B'Simcha. Just as when Av begins, one reduces one's happiness, once Adar begins, one increases one's happiness. Now, it's manifestly clear that if the template is from the reduction of happiness in Av, the reduction of happiness in Av isn't anything votive or anything necessarily natural, let alone inevitable. It's a command. It is imperative. Once Av begins, and this has halachic ramifications, you need to reduce your level of happiness, even if you don't feel like it. Well, in the same vein, once Adar begins, you need to increase your level of happiness, even if you don't feel like it. And arguably, there are a lot of reasons not to feel like it. I'll just note that with respect to this implicit principle in the Gemara, several decades ago, my oldest son pointed out to me that the Piasetzna, Rav Kalmish of Piasetzna, in his Sichot in the Warsaw Ghetto, reaches much the same conclusion, perhaps more on the level of drash, by noting the well-known equation that appears in Tirkei Zohar between Purim and Kippurim and Yom Kippur, and makes the observation then on the tails of that drash that just as on Yom Kippur, the inui, the self-affliction, is not something votive, but rather something that is required. So too, the rejoicing on Purim is something that is required, it's not something votive. Because again, you might not feel at all inclined to rejoice, but the imperative nonetheless remains. So again, converging on the same principle. Purim is not a day that in any glib manner leads us, much less impels us to rejoicing. To consider what that means, what it implies on manifold planes, perhaps the first level to consider is the one that is most glaring in Megillat Esther. That is, not at all incidentally, when the Gemara in Masechet Chulin famously asks the question, Esther min haTorah minayin, and the answer, Haster astir panai bayom hahu, I will surely hide my face in that day, that the whole framework of Megillat Esther is one of concealment. And of course, this finds its expression nowhere more overtly than the utter absence of God's name from Megillat Esther, which of course is unique to Megillat Esther as opposed to every other book in Tanakh. So that itself, of course, implies a level of darkness and concealment. Let's focus in particular on the heroes of Megillat Esther. And here, of course, we should bear in mind the obvious, which is, if anything, the opposite of the glib manner in which Megillat Esther is often treated. So the title role in Megillat Esther, of course, Esther herself. Twice in the second chapter of Megillat Esther, when Esther is taken to Beit HaMelech, to the royal household, and second, when she is taken to Achashverosh, the verb employed in the Megillah is, in both instances, vatilakach. She was taken. That doesn't imply anything about her own free volition. If anything, one could regard her as a victim of rape or of human trafficking. Certainly not the sort of glib celebration that we might otherwise apply to the circumstances. And famously, in this regard, when we read in chapter 4, when Esther acquiesces in Mordechai's demand of her to go to the king unsummoned, which could carry the death penalty, I will go in unto the king, not according to the law. And if I am lost, I am lost. On the most basic plane, of course, because she's doing something that could result in her immediate death if the king doesn't extend the golden scepter to her. On a deeper level, the idea that is famously enunciated in the Gemara in Tractate Megillah on page 15a, that Esther had a matrimonial tie to Mordechai. Exactly what that means we won't discuss right now. But that, in any case, until this moment, every time she came to Achashverosh, it was essentially compulsion. And her going to Achashverosh now, of her own free volition, means she's no longer anusa. Means her connection with Mordechai is critically, inexorably severed. And without getting into the level of drash in the Gemara, bottom line, what happens to Esther in this story? Where does she end up in all this? Of course, the answer is she ends up spending the rest of her life in the palace of a Gentile king. She isn't restored to Am Yisrael. She doesn't experience any redemption. She's lost. Reportedly, there were grave sites in Iran that were attributed to Mordechai and Esther. Whether they are really the grave sites or not, we have no idea. But certainly they're not in Eretz Israel. That is, whatever happened, it happened there. And there, her life ends. And Likewise, with respect to Mordechai, the final note of the Megillah, which ostensibly seems like a positive one. Mordechai was second to the king, great among the Jews, v'ratzui lerov echav, and he was accepted by most of his brethren. Most of his brethren, but not all. The Gemara, in focusing on the implications of Ratzui Lerov Echav in Tractate Megillah on page 16b, that some members of the Sanhedrin shunned him because he became excessively engaged in the matters of state and could no longer maintain the status that he had in Am Yisrael. As for his status in Am Yisrael, we read that in Sefer Ezra, in Ezra, the Common Reckoning, chapter 2, verse 2, and in the second half of Ezra that is popularly known as Nehemiah, even though in our tradition there's no such thing as a Sefer Nehemiah, but nonetheless in chapter 7, verse 7 there, that there is a list of those who are coming to Yerushalayim together with Zerubbabel, and that list includes Yeshua, Nehemiah, Sraya, Re'elaya, Mordechai, and others, but Mordechai is fifth on the list. So he had a senior role in the retinue of Zerubbabel, and he's not part of it. It's Lerov Echav and not more. And again, Mordechai doesn't return to Eretz Yisrael. Mordechai remains in Persia, and certainly according to the tradition, that there are grave sites there. He dies there. He's left there. There's no reconciliation, affirmation, personal redemption, no personal redemption at all. We'll note, too, one additional figure, admittedly an enigmatic one, in the Megillah, that is Hatach. Hatach, the one whom Esther trusts completely to act as go-between between her and Mordechai, when, remember, she's still keeping her ethnicity completely secret. And when she hears about Mordechai being in sackcloth and in mourning, it's specifically to Hatach that she appeals to go to Mordechai to know what was going on. And there's a back and forth mediated by Hatach. In Esther chapter 4, verse 6, so Hatach went forth to Mordechai, and Mordechai told him what happened. And verse 9, Hatach came and told Esther the words of Mordechai. And verse 10, Esther spoke to Hatach and gave him a message from Mordechai, and that's it. That's the last we read of Hatach. And enigmatically, bizarrely, in verse 12, rather than what we would have expected in context, which would have been, and Hatach told Mordechai the words of Esther, anonymously, they told Mordechai Esther's words. What happened to Hatach? And of course, once again, we seek an answer in the Midrash. The Midrash says that Haman sensed that Hatach was part of a conspiracy pertaining to Mordechai, pertaining to Esther. Ra'a Haman yotzeh uva leHatach veharago, and Haman killed him. So Hatach dies here. And of course, the story of that death becomes all the more significant in light of the Gemara. Granted, this is not simple, plain meaning of the Megillah, but nonetheless, in Tractate Megillah, on page 15a, Hatach ze Daniel, that we're reading the death scene of Daniel. Daniel dies in this anonymous, enigmatic role in Megillat Esther. So once again, on the level of the biographies that we encounter in Megillat Esther, there certainly isn't a story here of redemption, rather, if anything, on the contrary. But of course, beyond the level of the individual actors in the Megillah, on a national plane. On a national plane, we all know this is something we've discussed in previous discussions of Megillat Esther. How many times does Yerushalayim appear in all of Megillat Esther? Exactly once. Asher hogla Yerushalayim im hagola asher hoglata im Yechonia melech Yehuda asher hegla Nebuchadnezzar melech Babel. A verse that is clearly formulated with the subtlety of a well-aimed brick. 4 times declinations of Golah, that he was exiled from Yerushalayim with the exile that had been exiled, whom Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, had exiled. It's all about exile. Yerushalayim only appears in the context of exile, no other context. Indeed, one can't help but note the proposition of Rambam. As far as I'm aware, I believe it is an original proposal by Rambam, that why did Chazal institute that the cities that celebrate Purim together with Shushan on the 15th of Adar rather than the 14th are the cities that were walled from the time of Yehoshua? That is, by all logic, it should have been the cities that were walled from the time of Achashverosh. Why Yehoshua? Says Rambam, because at the time of Achashverosh in Eretz Yisrael, there were no walled cities because all the walls had been broken down. Because Eretz Yisrael was in a state of utter destruction. And in that destruction, there were no walled cities. So in Meilah, if the line of demarcation would have been cities that were walled in the time of Achashverosh, then no city in Eretz Yisrael would have that status. And Chachamim wanted to give Eretz Yisrael what I can only describe in context here as a consolation prize. At the very least, there should be some remembrance of Eretz Yisrael. So, no, we'll say cities that were walled from the time of Yehoshua, so at least Eretz Yisrael will have some kind of remembrance in this miracle. It has some kind of remembrance, but, bottom line, still is irrelevant. Eretz Yisrael is still in a state of destruction. The desolation hasn't ended. And of course, famously, when the Gemara discusses why we don't recite the Hallel on Purim, so the Gemara in Tractate Megillah on page 14a gives you 3 explanations, 2 of which are directly germane for this discussion. One, that how does Hallel begin? Hallelu Avdei Hashem. Praise God, or servants of God. Yeah, but that you can say when you're servants of God. So after Yetziat Mitzrayim, we were servants of Paro. Now we're servants of God. And after the events of Megillat Esther take place, we were servants of Achashverosh. Now we're still servants of Achashverosh. Nothing changed. Yehuda is still subject to the Persian Empire. We remain servants of Achashverosh. There isn't any basis for saying Hallel. The other answer, of course, that is likewise germane under these circumstances is because it's a miracle that happens outside of Eretz Yisrael. Miracles outside of Eretz Yisrael don't measure up. They don't warrant a Hallel. That's only a miracle that takes place in Eretz Yisrael, not a miracle that takes place outside of Eretz Yisrael. Which again, of course, is amplifying the extent to which this is not a story of redemption. A story of relief, not a story of redemption. And of course, inevitably, one cannot help but add the additional dimension that admittedly is not explicit in the text, but implicit, certainly as the Gemara understands it, that when Achashverosh says to Esther, Ma bakashatech ad chatzi hamalchut b'te'as, whatever you ask until half the kingdom, but not beyond. So this is the Gemara, which I think Megillah, page 15b. Chatzi hamalchut v'lo kol hamalchut v'lo davar shechotzetz lamalchut. not beyond half, not all of the Malchut, and not that which will sunder the Malchut, that is, don't ask for the building of the temple. Of course, understanding this drash in the context of the pshat of the Megillah, Achashverosh doesn't even know that Esther is Jewish. Don't even think about the temple. You had a Gentile king who commanded the temple should be rebuilt. Koresh, Cyrus. But so far as Achashverosh is concerned, it isn't going to happen. And indeed, we read in Ezra, in chapter 4, verse 4, Vayhi am haaretz merapim yedei am Yehuda u'mevahalim otam livnot. The people of the land weakened the hands of the people of Yehuda and harried them while they were building. And verse 6, of Malchut Achashverosh, b'tchilat Malchuto katvu sitna al yoshvei Yehuda v'Yerushalayim. That in the reign of Achashverosh, in the beginning of his reign, they wrote an accusation against the inhabitants of Yehuda and Yerushalayim, and the building of Beit HaMikdash was indeed stopped in the reign of Achashverosh, only to be continued and eventually completed during the reign of Darius. In our tradition, Darius was the son of Achashverosh and Esther. So maybe he had some consciousness of his roots on his mother's side of the family, and as a result, allowed for the completion of Beit HaMikdash. But certainly in the time of Achashverosh, there's no building. And again, we'll still note that whether Darius is formally, halachically Jewish or not, because his mother was Esther, he's lost to Am Yisrael, just like Esther is lost to Am Yisrael. So again, on this plane as well, we certainly do not sense a story of redemption. Rather, on the contrary, a story of relief, but the redemption is someplace off the screen in the future, inaccessible. And to that extent, inevitably, when we seek a template that can serve as a paradigm for this story, where do we seek it? Perhaps more than anywhere else, more than anyone else, in Rachel. Rachel, who, on the one hand, is the one whom Yaakov had contracted with Lavan to gain in matrimony. Rachel, for whom Yaakov works 7 years for Lavan. And they love one another. They're looking forward to the big day. And Rachel is, as it were, left with her tongue hanging out. And of course, the thrust of the Midrash, this is in particular the Midrash in Echaraba, in Tichta Kafhei, that because Yaakov and Rachel suspected Lavan of subterfuge, they had signs to ensure to Yaakov that it was Rachel who was indeed coming into the chuppah and not anyone else. But then Rachel sees it's not she, but it's her sister. And she has compassion on her sister, that her sister shouldn't be ashamed. So she gives her the simanim, the signs that enable Leah to trick Yaakov into thinking that she is Rachel. And the truth is, in the Midrash, it is far, far worse than being cheated out of her husband than what was to have been her wedding night. Her sister marries her husband rather than she. The Midrash describes it, it's almost beyond expressing, but the Midrash says this, that all that night, when Yaakov would be speaking to Leah, Leah would keep silent, and Rachel was under the bed, and she would answer on Leah's behalf, so that Yaakov wouldn't realize that it wasn't Rachel who was in the bed with him. That is, to even express such a thing, it boggles the mind. to be so close and so abysmally far under the bed, no closer. And even when she does get Yaakov's hand in marriage, she's still the second wife. And I feel compelled to add here a dimension that is first enunciated by Ramban on Parashat Toldot. When we read the praise that God heaps upon Avraham, Ekev asher shema Avraham b'koli vayishma mishmati mitzvotai chukotai v'torotai, that Avraham kept my Torahs. And Rashi cites the Midrash that Avraham kept the Torah before it was given. And Ramban, even though this isn't a pshat according to Ramban, but Ramban, in elucidating what the Midrash that Rashi cites means, asks a whole battery of questions, such as, how could it be that Yaakov married two sisters, according to Chazal, that Zilpah and Bilhah were also sisters from a Pilegesh? How could he marry four sisters? Whether two, four, it doesn't make a difference, but how could he do such a thing? Clearly forbidden by the Torah. And Ramban in Parashat Toldot gives you the paradigm. The paradigm is the Avot kept the Torah according to this Midrash before it was given. Kimisha ino mitzvah says one who isn't commanded and nonetheless does. In other words, they weren't required because they weren't yet a nation that received the Torah, but they kept the mitzvot. However, inasmuch as we read in Parashat Beit Hanan, Lasot ken bekerev haaretz, that the Torah is something that you keep in the land. Ramban consistently refers to the Torah as mishpat elkei haaretz, which is a longer discussion. We won't get into it right now. So the Avot kept the Torah with complete fidelity inside Eretz Yisrael, not outside of Eretz Yisrael. Of course, it doesn't mean they gratuitously violated the Torah outside of Eretz Yisrael, but they allowed other considerations, such as who is one's designated soulmate, to enter into their decisions outside of Eretz Yisrael. And so it was outside of Eretz Yisrael that Yaakov marries two sisters, Leah and Rachel. That's what Ramban states in Parashat Toldot. But he doesn't state there. But he does state in the preeminent comment of Ramban on the subject of Eretz Yisrael, which is in Parashat Achrei Mot, that is in Vayikra, chapter 18, verse 25. It's almost beyond imagining. It says Ramban, and that's why Rachel had to die when they came back to Eretz Yisrael. Because in deference to Yaakov, when they came back to Eretz Yisrael, he would not be married to two sisters, which the Torah would forbid. And in deference to Rachel, to spare her the indignity of being divorced because she was the second sister who was married, and therefore she was the one whose marriage was, in effect, a violation of what would be the Torah's prohibition. To spare her the disgrace of divorce, she died. The bottom line is, she's dead. Further exemplifying the extent to which she doesn't get to the culmination, the fruition. And indeed, she does not. On so many levels, she does not. Even after marrying Yaakov, she's the one who is barren. Leah has 6 sons and a daughter. Even Bilhah and Zilpah have 2 sons apiece, and Rachel has nothing. And when she finally has a child, what does she have to say? How does she express herself at that juncture? Asaf Elokim et cherpati. She still in a state of disgrace. Asaf Elokim et Chepati, but that's not really the etymology of her son's name, which is not Asaf, but Yosef. Vatikra et Shmo Yosef Limo Yosef Hashem li ben acher. Her tongue is still hanging out. Give me another son. And then, of course, we read about the circumstances of the birth of that second son in Parashat Vayishlach, Bereshit chapter 35. Vayis'u mi Beit El vayhi od kivrat haaretz lavo Efrata. They journeyed from Beit El. There was still some way to come to Efrat. Vateled Rachel vatkash belideta. And Rachel travailed, and she had hard labor. And it came to pass when she was in hard labor, the midwife said unto her, "Fear not, for this also is a son to you." As her soul was departing, for she died. Ben Oni. She called his name Ben Oni, son of my distress. The Midrash in Beishit Rabbah says, Bar Tsa'ari Bilshon Arami, son of my anguish. Vaviv Karalo Binyamin. His father called him Binyamin, Binyamin, son of my right, son of my strength. But Tamot Rachel. And Rachel died and was buried in the way to Efrat, B'derech Efrata, which is Beit Lechem. And Yaakov set up a pillar upon her grave, which is the pillar of Rachel's grave until this day. And Rachel dies, this constantly recurring, terrifying motif, B'derech, on the way. Likewise, when Yaakov is reminiscing to Yosef the circumstance of Rachel's death in Parashat Ve'echi, Bereshit chapter 48. As for me, when I came from Padan, Rachel died on me in the land of Canaan on the way. When there's still some way to come to Efrat, and I buried her there on the way to Efrat, which is Beit Lechem. So one considers we have En Korin Avot El Lishlosha, En Korin Imahot El Arba. We have 3 holy fathers, 4 holy mothers, and every one of them, except one, is buried in Ma'arat HaMachpelah. As Yaakov expresses it to his sons on his deathbed, when he's bidding them to bury him in Ma'arat HaMachpelah, Shama kavru et Abraham ve'et Sarah ishto, Shama kavru et Yitzchak ve'et Rivka ishto, ve'Shama kavarti et Leah. They buried Abraham and Sarah his wife, they buried Yitzchak and Rivka his wife, there I buried Leah. And there I want to be buried too. And everyone is buried in Ma'arat HaMachpelah except one, except Rachel. Where is she? Baderech. She's on the way. And it isn't something that only pertains to Rachel herself. It's something that pertains likewise to her descendants. In the case of Binyamin, when the mysterious ruler of Egypt says, you got to come back with that youngest son, and the Shevatim plead with Yaakov to send him, what is Yaakov's response? Lo yired b'ni imachem, ki achiv met v'hu lebado nish'aru ka'ahu ason baderech. My son isn't going down with you, for his brother is dead, he alone is left, and if harm befalls him on the way that you go, then I'll go down to the grave in anguish. And the comment in the Midrash that what in effect Yaakov is saying, oily, woe unto me, is there a decree upon Rachel and her children to all die on the way? She died on the way. Yosef died on the way, as far as he knows at this point. Met Yosef baderech. If this one dies on the way, I'm going after him. I'm dying in anguish, in moaning. And in a similar vein, when Yehuda is standing before this mysterious ruler in Parashat Vayigash, in Bereshit chapter 44, we said to my Lord, this youth cannot leave his father. If he leaves his father, he's going to die. Why is he going to die just because he leaves his father? The truth of the matter is, he isn't such a young man at this point either. And Rashi cites, based upon the Midrash, V'yazav et aviv v'met, if he leaves his father, he will die. If he leaves his father, we're afraid he's going to die on the way, because his mother also died on the way. I'm telling you, there's something almost genetic. Rachel and her family and her descendants constantly are on the way. And we see this played out, of course, not only in her immediate descendants. We continue with the first great leader that descends from Rachel, Yoshua. And we read in chapter 13 of Yoshua, beginning of the chapter, Yoshua ba zaken ba bayamim. Yoshua was old, well stricken in years, and God said to him, "Ata zakanta bata vayamim." You're old and well stricken in years. Ha'aretz nish'ara habei me'od l'rishtah, and there remains yet very much of the land to be possessed, and he didn't finish the mission. Even though it's the supreme irony, Yoshua is the one to bring them into Eretz Yisrael. So you'd think he isn't the one who's left on the way, but he is left on the way because he still hasn't completed the mission. And most of Israel don't acquire their portion in Eretz Yisrael in the lifetime of Yoshua. And the contrast is all the most striking. In the next chapter, chapter 14, we read of how Kalev ben Yefuneh, the only surviving spy together with Yoshua, says to Yoshua, reminiscing on what had happened way back 45 years earlier. He says, I was 40 years old when Moshe, servant of God, sent me from Kadesh Barnea to scout out the land. And I responded as was what was in my heart. I gave a positive report of the land. And he goes on to say, today I'm 85 years old. And I'm as strong today as it was then. My strength then is my strength now. I'm still young. Kalev is still young. Yoshua, a chapter earlier, is old. And of course, the culmination of that in chapter 23, when Yoshua says to the people, I'm going baderech, on the way of all the earth, meaning I'm about to die. I'm about to die, and he's pleading with them. But, consider therefore in your heart, in all your soul, not one thing failed of all the good things that God your Lord spoke concerning you. All are come to pass unto you, and not one thing has failed. And be faithful to God. But so long, I'm not going to be accompanying you. Yoshua stays baderech. And perhaps most strikingly, the next great leader from the descendants of Rachel, this time not from the tribe of Ephraim like Yoshua, but rather from Binyamin, Shaul. And Shaul really, in the utmost sense of the term, signifies the king who is left baderech. And it's so striking that when at the end of Shaul's pursuit of David, when David cuts off the corner of Shaul's garment in order to drive home the fact that he could have killed him if he wanted to, but he doesn't want to kill him. And this is in Shmuel, the Common Reckoning, Shmuel Aleph, chapter 24, that when David reproaches Shaul, verse 16, Shaul says, Hakol Chazeh bni David. Is it your voice, my son David? Vayisa Shaul kolo vayivk. And Shaul lifted up his voice and he wept. And he says to David, Tzaddik ata mimeni, ki ata gmaltani hatova v'ani gmalticha hara'a. You are more righteous than I. You rendered unto me good, whereas I rendered unto you evil. And what's the lesson he has to ask of David? I mean, it's a tragic figure. In verses 20 and 21, I know you're going to be reigning. You will surely be king. And the kingdom of Israel will be established in your hand. So I'm just begging, swear now to me by God that you will not cut off my seed after me, and you will not destroy my name out of my father's house. Because I'm leaving and I'm baderech. And there is no culmination, and there is no conclusion. And one cannot help but append here, besides the obvious connection, which is, of course, to the events of Megillat Esther, not at all incidentally, Kish, as a patronymic, is cited as the father of Shaul and as one of the named ancestors. And, of course, continuing beyond Shaul, besides the obvious, the heroes of Megillat Esther. That is, Mordechai is explicitly described as Ish Yemini. That is, he is a Benjaminite. Esther is his cousin, so manifestly they are Bnei Shel Rachel. Not at all incidentally, the name Kish appears in two contexts in Tanakh, only two, as the name of Shaul's father and as part of the lineage of Mordechai. So we understand whence Chazal are coming in telling us that Mordechai is a descendant of Shaul. But of course, the bottom line is again, Mordechai and Esther further exemplify baderech. And if I may cite one additional, admittedly enigmatic illustration of the principle, what the Gemara expounds on Zechariah chapter 12, verses 10 and 11, regarding Mashiach ben Yosef. That there is Mashiach as Mashiach ben David, but the Gemara in Masechet Sukkah, Daf Nun Bet Amud Aleph, page 52a, talks about another messianic figure that is descended from Yosef. And in what context does he appear in these psukim? Exclusively in the context of his dying, without reaching any culmination, without any redemption. I'll pour upon the house of David and upon the inhabitants of Yerushalayim the spirit of grace and of supplication, and they will look upon me because they have thrust him through. And again, Chazal say, thrust him through, Mashiach ben David, who died. And they will mourn for him as one mourns for his only son, and will be in bitterness for him as one is in bitterness for his firstborn. In that day, there will be a great mourning in Yerushalayim as the mourning of a Hadad Rimon in the valley of Megiddo. So again, without trying to understand what this phase of redemption that is called Mashiach ben Yosef signifies, What's relevant for our purposes is it also remains baderech. It doesn't come to any ultimate sense of culmination. And what does it signify? Again, this constant recurring theme of baderech, not getting to the conclusion, only remaining baderech, stuck in the middle. So, of course, inevitably, the first point to appreciate in this regard, the idea that is enunciated in the Midrash, in Bereshit Rabbah, that Yaakov buries Rachel specifically baderech, shagaluyot atidot la'avor sham, levichach kivara sham k'dei she'hem mevakeshet alehim rachamim. That Yaakov saw that baderech will also be on the way as the exiles are going into exile, and that they would pass by her grave. Now, obviously, this is an issue that should not be treated facilely. We know that the tzadikah, is not at the site of the grave. That is, only the dust is there. As we read in the last chapter of Kohelet, the dust returns upon the earth as it was, the spirit returns to God who gave it. And yet still, it is an uncompromisable tradition that there is a sanctity that is inherent in the body because the body was the receptacle for that divine soul. The Ruach Elokim that returns Kiviyachol, Ela Elokim Asher Natana, still sanctifies the body, which is, of course, why there's such a premium placed upon proper burial of the body and speedy burial of the body. I know it was observed to me many years ago that in old cultures in which monotheism is well established, any means for dealing with a dead body other than burial is shunned. And it's where monotheism is compromised, eclipsed, that we find other means of, disposal of bodies, such as cremation, becoming ascendant. So on some plane, the fact that this is Kvurat Rachel has significance, has centrality. Yaakov indeed makes a pillar monument to Rachel at the site of her death, and explicitly in Sefer Shmuel we read about Kvurat Rachel. We read about the place of the burial of Rachel as a place that was known in the time of Shmuel. So when the Midrash says that there is significance to this in terms of the Galuyot, Am Yisrael is Baderech to Galut. And the antidote to that Baderech is Rachel being Baderech. And this is further amplified in the same Midrash in Eicha Rabbah that we cited earlier, the self-sacrifice of Rachel. The self-sacrifice of Rachel is the basis of her Kiviyachol, her supplication to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, to not forsake Am Yisrael. And the Midrash concludes, Miyad nitgalgelu rachamav shel HaKadosh Baruch Hu, that's what summons, as it were, the compassion of God in saying, for your sake, Rachel, I'm going to restore Yisrael to their place. The promise that while Rachel is weeping for her children, God says, refrain your voice from weeping, your eyes from tears. For there is reward for your work, says God. They shall come back from the land of their enemy, and moreover, there is hope in your end. There's an end beyond the derech. When the children will return to their own border. And your being where you are, baderech, is in some sense the means to the procuring of that final culmination. Indeed, in Tanad Ve'Eliyahu emerges that were it not for this supplication, the Midrash says that once Yisrael go into exile among the nations of the world, Kivyachol, it was in the mind of God that they should never be gathered. Were it not for Rachel's prayer before HaKadosh Baruch Hu, before God, that resulted in this promise of the restoration. So Rachel then being Baderech is in some sense the utmost promise for her children who are Baderech to eventually get home. But on a deeper level, that Rachel signifies the archetypal polar opposite of that singular individual who, more than any other, is the antithesis of Baderech. Who's the antithesis of Baderech? The one who, even when he's born, which is sensibly the utmost Baderech, because a newborn baby is just nothing, just potential. But the one who, even when he's born, is already Asui, finished, Esav. That as we read regarding Esav, when he is born, Vayitzer Rishon Admoni, Kulo Ke'aderet Se'ar, it's in Parashat Toldot, Bereshit, chapter 25, verse 25, he came out ruddy, all over like a hairy mantle, like he's already grown up. And everyone called him Esav. And indeed, as the commentators note, Esav, Asui, he's finished, he's done. He's not Baderech. He's already finished work. He's a finished work, not merely physically. That in as much as the essence, the hallmark of being human is to be on a trajectory of growth and development, Esav isn't. He's spiritually inert. He's not going anywhere. And he, of course, again, represents the polar opposite of Rachel, and it's something that represents an antithetical tension throughout history. Because, of course, as we read regarding Esav in Parashat Vayishlach, in Bereshit, chapter 36, Ada bore to Esav Eliphaz. Eliphaz is the firstborn of Esav, and subsequently we read the Timnai Tapilegesh Eliphaz ben Esav, Bateled Eliphaz et Amalek. The Timnah was concubine to Eliphaz, Esav's son, and she bore to Eliphaz Amalek. And none of them, absolutely none, are Baderech anywhere. And that Am Yisrael is Baderech, is a constant, relentless goad. Am Yisrael summoned indeed to be Baderech. We go into exile because there's still something that needs to be actualized. And the punishment is intended as means the attainment of that. And ultimately, in the end, where do we see the culmination of that Baderech? In the prophecy of Obadiah, Vaya Beit Yaakov Esh Uveit Yosef lehava Uveit Esav lekash v'dalku bahem be'achalom v'lo yeh sari leveit Esav ki Hashem diber. That the house of Yaakov, fire. The house of Yosef, descendant of Rachel, flame. And the house of Esav, stubble. And they will kindle in them, devour them, and there will not be any remaining of the house of Esav, for God has spoken. And if we ask, what's the primary asset of the lehava? Indeed, as Rashi cites it in Parashat Vayetze, on the apparent causal relationship that is specifically once Rachel gives birth to Yosef, that Yaakov says to Lavan, Shalcheni be'elchai mi'ul artzi, I'm going home. Why specifically then? Because Yosef has been born. Because Yosef is, as it were, the stano shel Esav, the antithesis of Esav. Because after all, Esav isn't Baderech. He is static. What's the difference between a flame and fire? Fire can be static. Flame is necessarily transitive, going out. And it's precisely the basis of our victory over Esav. Hence, indeed, the thrust of Yaakov's readiness to confront Esav once Yosef is born. And the Midrash in Psik Darabati, in Parasha Yud Gimel, makes this point stridently clear, that when Yaakov arrays his household and Rachel is furthest back, why is Rachel in back? Because it's Rachel and Yosef. Even if Esav gets everyone else, if Yosef is still around, Esav is through. Yosef is the guarantor of being redeemed from Esav, precisely because Esav isn't Baderech and Yosef is Baderech, and that dynamism is the key, is the core of being able to vanquish Esav and everything that he signifies. And again, of course, besides the implication of what we read in the narrative of Parashat Vayetzeh, that it is when Yosef is born that Yaakov is ready to go back home and confront Esav. The simple pshat of what we read in Ovadia, that in order to consume the house of Esav, you need not only the fire of Beit Yaakov, but the flame, the dynamism, the baderech, which is after all what a flame is, that comes from Beit Yosef. And this indeed is precisely what we see historically, not only in Esav, but in his descendants, and in particular, in that descendant upon which we focus most relentlessly, Amalek. And I feel compelled to note, it should be clear to us. 5 times in Megillat Esther, Haman is described as Ha'agagi. Besides Megillat Esther, we encounter Agag in only 2 other contexts in Tanakh. The first, in the final mashal, the final parable of Bil'am, Yizal Maim Midolya v'zarob Maim Rabim v'yarom me'agag malko v'tinaseh malchuto. The water shall flow from his buckets, his seed shall be many waters, and his king shall be higher than Agag, which presumably, on the most basic shot level, is an allusion to Shaul, who does battle with Agag. And the second context, of course, being that battle of Shaul with Amalek in Sefer Shmuel, in Shmuel Aleph, in chapter 15. So we have Agag in these 3 contexts. Are they 3 different people? Of course, tantalizing possibility that just as every king of Egypt is called Paro, every king of Gerar is called Avimelech, and every king of Amalek is called Agag. Haman is the ideological descendant of Amalek. And what is precisely the confrontation with Amalek, as we read it, of course, in Parashat Zachor, Bezrat Hashem, this coming Shabbat, Zachor et asher asa lecha Amalek, baderech b'tzeidechem mitzrayim. Remember what Amalek did to you on the way, as you were coming from Egypt. Asher karecha baderech, happened upon you, chanced upon you when you were on the way. Smote the hind, most of you, all that were enfeebled in your rear, when you were faint and weary, and he did not fear God. Baderech. The attack is baderech. You're on your way out of Mitzrayim, out of Egypt, toward the theophany at Mount Sinai, and that's precisely where Amalek comes unprovoked, to prevent you from being baderech, to prevent you from being on the way. And the next confrontation with Amalek in the time of Shaul, the time of Shaul is when we're getting ready for Binyan Beit HaMikdash. There is a dynamism, there's an expectation, the establishment of the monarchy, the establishment of Beit HaMikdash, and again, the confrontation with Amalek. And the next time, again, the events of Megillat Esther. But I'm citing here, once again, Chazal established this connection in Ezra chapter 4, that Malchut Achashverosh b'tchilat Malchuto katvu sitna al yoshvei Yehuda v'Yerushalayim. Then in the reign of Achashverosh, in the beginning of his reign, they wrote an accusation against the inhabitants of Yehuda and Yerushalayim, and the building of Beit HaMikdash is stopped. And again, Ad Chatzia Malchut, don't even ask for Beit HaMikdash. For all of Achashverosh's reign, Beit HaMikdash isn't going to be completed. Because Am Yisrael Baderech, they're on the way to the completion, to the establishment. And Amalek is there, the Haman, to write that sitna in order to prevent that culmination, in order to prevent getting beyond the derech to the final culmination. But simultaneously, again in Psikta Rabati, in Parasha Yud Bet, there is a whole ma'arechet, a whole series of contrasts between Esav and Yosef. Not that they're parallel, they're anti-parallel. In other words, that the descendants of Rachel signify precisely what constitutes the antidote to Esav. The spiritual inertness of Esav is what becomes ameliorated through the spiritual dynamism that is manifest precisely in Rachel and in her descendants. And of course, ultimately, this is a paradigm not only for Rachel, not only for her children, but Bichlal, for our mission in the world. And perhaps the most apt expression of this is what we read in the Beracha that HaKadosh Baruch Hu gives Zechariah to deliver to Yoshua Kohen Gadol. We discussed this pasuk on many occasions in the past. The pasuk reads, if you walk in my ways, you keep my charge, judge my house, keep my courts, then translating literally, I will give you walkers among these standing ones. Who are the walkers? Who are the standing ones? As we've discussed in the past, the standing ones are the angels. As we read in Yechezkel, in the first chapter of Ezekiel, Malachim are static. They are created as spiritual beings, so they remain. At the opposite pole, the Behemah, as Maharal notes, Ma, whatever it is already inside. The angel is created as a spiritual being, and so it remains. The beast is created as an exclusively physical being, and so it remains. And only man is Mehalech, the walking one, because man comes into this world as a completely physical being endowed with spiritual potential. And the whole course of life is to actualize that potential. In other words, to be a Mehalech means in this world, constantly, inexorably, to be Baderech. That's precisely the summons of man. It is, of course, in this vein that Maharal gives us the etymology of Adam coming from Adama, precisely because, certainly in an agrarian society, the mechanism for actualizing a latent potential is the earth. You place the small seed in the earth, and a mighty tree grows there. The earth is what represents the means for actualizing potential. That's what man is all about. That's what being Adam is all about. That's what being a Hamalech is all about. Or to express it alternatively, in the words of Iyov, in Iyov, chapter 5, Ki Adam le'amal yulad, uvnei reshef yagbi uf. Man is born to labor. The flying beings fly upward. The angels, again, are the flying beings. They fly upward effortlessly because they're spiritual. And man comes into this world to labor, to toil, to be baderech. And precisely by dint of being baderech, to be able to actualize the mission with which he is endowed, blessed in this world, because that really, more than anything else, is precisely what life is all about. And of course, the utmost culmination, as Yaakov expresses it to Esav, when they have their meeting and ostensible reconciliation, and Esav says, we'll take our journey, we'll be baderech, together. And Yaakov finds his excuse. My Lord knows the children are tender, the flocks and herds giving suck are care to me. If they overdrive them one day, all the flocks will die. Let my Lord pass over before his servant, and I will journey on slowly according to the pace of the cattle that are before me and according to the pace of the children until I come unto my Lord to Seir. And of course, famously, the Yerushalmi notes, the Midrash notes that we don't find that Yaakov ever came to Seir. So the question as formulated in the Midrash that Yaakov, after all, is Titene Medli Yaakov, could he say deceitfully, I'm going to Seir, but he's not planning on going? And of course, the answer, well, he's going. He's still going. When does Yaakov get to Seir? When, as we read in the culmination of the Nivuah of Ovadia, the culmination of the downfall of Esav, that saviors will come up in Mount Zion to judge the mountain of Esav, and the kingdom will be the Lord's. And that's, after all, precisely what Chazal emphasize as the culmination of this entire narrative, when the Midrash in Dvarim Rabbah tells us that when indeed we see the fulfillment of the house of Yaakov is fire, the house of Yosef flame, and they consume the house of Esav. Amar HaKadosh Baruch Hu, Ota sha'a ani mofia malchuti v'em lo chalichem. At that time, not before, but at that time, I appear in my kingship and reign over you. Until then, HaKadosh Baruch Hu is in concealment. Until then, we are baderech. And I know we've noted this in the past. Perhaps one of the most vivid, heart-rending expressions of this is as we read it. As we read it, after all, in Megillat Esther, that the moment that evil incarnate is unmasked, when Esther says, Ish, sar ve'oyev, Haman hara hazeh, what's the next thing that happens? The Melech is gone. The king disappears. The king arises in his fury and goes out to the garden. And Esther is left alone with Haman. What could be more terrifying? Evil unmasked, and she's alone with evil. Of course, it only lasts for a moment. Because the next pasuk, and that's it. That the king returns, he sees Haman's falling on the couch that Esther is on, and he says, it's the end of Haman. But for that brief moment, the king is nowhere to be found. And you can be sure for Esther, that brief moment may seem like an eternity. And moreover, we all know very well the Midrash commenting on the absence of Hashem's name in Megillat Esther. So there are different versions of the Midrash in Esther Rabbah that when the Megillah says Amelech Achashverosh, it's referring exclusively to Achashverosh. When we read Melech Stam, the king, then it's Mashamesh Kodesh V'chol. Then it intimates both Achashverosh and Kodesh and HaKadosh Baruch Hu. In the later ascensions of the Midrash of Esther, in Midrash Panim Acherim and Midrash Abba Gurion, it's even more extreme. That when it says Achashverosh, it means Achashverosh. When it says Melech Stam, it means only Hashem. You try to read the Megillah that way, it can blow your mind. But in any case, here, it says Melech Stam. So the king disappears. And just for an instant, the king. As we read in Psalm 90, Yizmor Tzadi, Ki elef shanim be'enecha ki omet molki abo ve'ashmaro l'ayla. 1,000 years in your eyes as the yesterday that has passed and a watch in the night. That instant, who can even begin to fathom how long that instant can last? in human consciousness, in human terms. But still and all, the promise that the king comes back. Again, apropos of the Midrash and Dvarim Rabbah, that HaKadosh Baruch Hu is indeed going to be revealed and reign over us. But that's in the future. We aren't there yet. And to note in that vein, one final dimension that inevitably is one of the most poignant themes that we observe in Megillat Esther. When Esther puts her life on the line, just to say, Yavo HaMelech v'Haman Hayom, the most explicit allusion to Shem Hashem, to God's holy name, the Rashi Tevot of Yavo HaMelech v'Haman Hayom, Yud followed by Hey, followed by Vav, followed by Hey. Let the king and Haman come this day to a wine feast. That's a horrible king and a viceroy who was evil incarnate. And that's the allusion to God's holy name. But that's today. And at the wine feast, when Achashverosh asks the question, so what do you want? That is in Esther in chapter 5. Guess what do you want? Whatever your petition is, it shall be granted, whatever your request, even only to half the kingdom. But still, what do you want? And what's Esther's response? My petition and request is, can you come back tomorrow? יבוא המלך ואמן על משתה אשר אעשה להם ומחר אעשה כדבר המלך. The king and Haman come to the banquet that I will prepare for them, and I'll do what the king said tomorrow. Now, she already put her life in jeopardy just to ask them to come to the wine feast the first time. The king could just get fed up and say enough already. So I see tomorrow. So, of course, on the one hand, we can respond on perhaps something of a prosaic plane, but nonetheless a meaningful one, that perhaps Esther is looking for a sign. At this point, it's all dark. What's going to happen tomorrow? So what's going to happen tomorrow, of course, is Nadidash Nat HaMelech. The king has his insomnia, and the book of remembrance is read before the king, and he hears about what Mordechai did to save his life, and he seeks to know what he can do to honor Mordechai, and Haman comes because he wants to hang Mordechai, and the king, okay, we understand. The next day, Haman is riding Mordechai around town, speaking in his praise, this is what will be done to the man whom the king seeks to honor. There also it says, HaMelech, not Melech Achashverosh. So tomorrow will be the time, but on a deeper level. In the first encounter with Amalek, what does Moshe say to Yehoshua? When we read in Shemot chapter 17, Amalek came and fought with Israel in Refidim. And Moshe says to Yehoshua, choose us men, and go and fight with Amalek. Machar, tomorrow I will stand on the top of the hill with the staff of God in my hand. Tomorrow. Today we're still baderech. We're on the way. And our tongues are still hanging out. The victory over Amalek is in the world of Machar. Because ultimately, Machar, as Esther expresses it, also, Amalek Stam, Tomorrow I will do as the king says. Tomorrow our fidelity to the king will be complete. Only tomorrow we won't be baderech. In this world, we're still baderech. In this world, all of Megillat Esther is concealment, and it's baderech. In this world, we don't get to the culmination. And on the one hand, that is unequivocally the tragic dimension that we see throughout Megillat Esther, throughout the biography of Rachel and her descendants, and really all of us. We're mehalchim. We're not omdim. But that in itself, after all, is the great consolation. That is, if all that there would be what we see now, and we're standing here walking with our tongues hanging out, baderech, on the way, that would really be depressing. But the very fact that you're baderech, you're on the way to, it's not here now. But in that world of tomorrow, it will be. That's the victory over Amalek. Esav epitomizes being static, spiritually inert. Asui, finished, done. No growth, no development. We signify precisely the opposite. That constant dynamism of being baderech. And that more than anything else is the harbinger of the tomorrow in which, Be'ezrat Hashem, we will be able to say, and we will see together how tomorrow, in that realm of tomorrow, HaKadosh Baruch Hu appears in his glory and reigns over us. And rather than the mere purkan of Megillat Esther, and we live in a world in which all we've got is purkan. And on so many levels, this year in particular, even purkan would sound like a lot. But it's all about derech. And it does ultimately lead to the culmination of the complete geula b'mehera v'yameinu. Purim Sameach.